Hello, gentle viewers, and welcome to another episode of Alistair Reviews It. If you hear any heavy breathing, that's just Winifred. She is on the couch with me right now. Today we are going to be talking about my self-distancing book list in light of today's coronavirus. So most of us are putting forth an effort to keep a distance from each other and to self-quarantine in order to slow down the effects of the virus. So these next 6 books are my recommendations for you. Winifred, really? My first recommendation is Inside Out by Demi. My husband and I read this one. Well, we listened to this one because it's actually narrated by Demi. It's a memoir, and it's very insightful. Yeah, Demi Moore takes you from when she was a child all the way up till now, explains some pivotal points in her career, and there is a lot. It's always interesting to me to see like celebrities and them go through what they're going through in the media, and then for them to explain what's going on the other side, and you get to kind of see that with Demi Moore's memoir, which is actually very well written, and I would recommend the audiobook because her very notable husky voice is just great. It's just great. So if you're looking for an audiobook, that's my recommendation. My next recommendation is a low fantasy. So I just recently read Stormfront of the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and not surprisingly good. I figured it would be good, but there's not many books that are first person, especially first person fantasy, that I really get into, and I really got into this. I especially got into it, again, on the audiobook, because James Marsters, otherwise known as Spike from Buffy and Angel, is in this book. Well, not in the book, but he reads the book. And let me tell you, the audio of this is pretty freaking amazing. And I think Jim Butcher does an excellent job just outlining this character. He fully fleshes him out. He makes it so that this character has a lot of faults and a lot of great attributes that make him a character that you can completely get behind and understand his motives and whatever he's doing. It is a low fantasy, so it takes place in Chicago, and he's basically a private investigator, but a private fantastical wizard investigator who focuses on more paranormal things. So it kind of harkens back to the 1940s, 1950s, the 1940s, 1950s detective dramas that you would listen to on the radio. So that's what it reminds me of. And I think that's a perfectly great stay-in just paperback that you just pick up or you just listen to while you're cleaning or something. My next recommendations is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Jenkins Reid. I know I already talked about this one in my favorite books of 2019, but I want to hit upon that again because this is a great historical fiction. And I would call it historical fiction. I understand that I would, even though it's made as a memoir nowadays from somebody who's talking about their past, I would call it a historical fantasy. And it has a lot of intrigue in it. It has a lot of old Hollywood. It's very juicy. And the characters are very well fleshed out. And it also has Taylor Jenkins Reid's signature, I would call it signature now, writing style, where she writes in a different way than most of other novelists that I've ever encountered. It's a very good, satisfying read. You will not be disappointed. I don't think that this is a disappointing book at all, and I think it follows through very satisfyingly. My next one is a fantasy book. I do... Winifred, come on. My next book recommendation is a fantasy book. I do mostly read fantasy, so a lot of my recommendations are going to be fantasy. And this next one is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. There are 2 big reasons to read this book. One, if you've ever heard of a second person book, this nobody's ever heard of a second person book, a book that was written from second person, and I never thought that that would actually work out. It for me, it's always something that you try in second grade, and then your teacher always was like, "Oh, that's a really weird way to write." But this book, it just works. It works perfectly. It is written in second person, and it might feel weird to read in second person, but if you get through the first couple of chapters, you can go along with it. It's actually a very good read. It's also, it's not a Western fantasy setting. It's a very new fantasy setting. A really good world building by N.K. Jemisin, and she comes in and she brings. Not only does she bring a different fantasy background than most fantasies that we read now, most high fantasies that we read now, but she also brings in kind of some diversity to our typical characters. I would say most characters aren't written with a race in mind, but I do think that she brings it to the next level with just bringing some diversity and some identity to some characters. Because I do like when there's some diversity in the books, and it's not just like ambiguous. So, and I also feel like it doesn't. I've heard a lot of people talk about it, but I don't think this book has gotten the outspread word of mouth that it really deserves. So, I would pick it up and I would read it if I were you, especially during this outbreak. It's a good time to do it. My next one is if you really want to start a long, or not even finish series, but like you're like, hey, I finally have the chance to start one of those big books. I would recommend The Way of Kings, especially if you are into fantasy. The Way of Kings is the way to go. This book series probably won't be completed within the next, I want to say 20 years, according to Brandon Sanderson, but if there is a time to start on probably what is going to be the best epic fantasy of our generation, now is the time. Take it. There's not much I can say in terms of plotting or end game in terms of what the storytelling is going towards, because each book is a little bit different, and I feel like we're still trying to build the plot throughout. But I will say that Brandon Sanderson brings in excellent character development. He brings in excellent world building into his books. And you have the Brandon Sanderson avalanche with each one of these. That's towards the end of the book. Everything kind of clicks together and just one big whoosh of just like amazingness. So if you are into that, I would pick it up. My last recommendation is a book I actually read a while ago. It's called The Compound by S.A. Bodeen. So I read this book in high school. It basically is about a family that is living in a compound, and they've lived in a compound for 6 years after a nuclear holocaust happened. And you kind of go through their trials and tribulations of living in that area and the scarcity that happens, especially after living for 6 years, no matter how much you've stockpiled, and them questioning whether they should leave the compound or not. And there's a lot of psychological layering that goes into it. And I remember being riveted by this book when I read it. And I feel like that kind of it's kind of along the theme of being quarantined or social distancing. What's more social distancing than distancing yourself off from the rest of the world, and not knowing whether the rest of the world is still there or not. So those are my recommendations for my social distancing book list. Please let me know what kind of recommendations you have. I don't even know how long this distancing will last, so I might need some recommendations too. Please wash your hands, take care of yourself, and keep up with the news. Adiós. Hasta luego.